When Delaney Brooks stepped out of the black SUV, everyone in Millhaven assumed she had come to buy land, but she didn't want the farmhouse, the fields, or the pastures stretching toward the tree line. The only thing she wanted was a rotting barn at the far edge of the Callaway property. She placed a check for $2 million on the table and told Rhett she wanted that barn alone. When he asked if she'd like to see inside first, she shook her head without a single word. That was the moment Rhett understood she wasn't just making a business deal. She was trying to erase something, and she was more afraid of that barn than anyone in Millhaven had ever been. The Callaway farm sat at the end of a two-lane road that most people in Millhaven, Tennessee had stopped bothering to drive down years ago. The house itself was modest, white siding gone grey, with two mismatched chairs, a rope swing in the side yard that Rhett's daughter Gracie had outgrown 3 summers back. The land was honest land, 30 acres of field grass and old timber, a creek that flooded every March without fail, and a horse pen with one aging mare that cost more to feed than she was worth. By any reasonable measure, property had value. The barn at the back of it did not. Most people in town had been saying that for 15 years, the structure was weathered to the color of ash, its roof sagging in the center like a man carrying too much weight, 3 of the side planks rotted through entirely, and in winter the wind passed straight through the walls without slowing. Barney Pruitt, who owned the hardware store 2 blocks off Main Street, had told Rhett at least a dozen times that he ought to tear it down, haul off the timber, and reclaim the land. There was no reason to keep a building that couldn't hold anything anymore. Everyone said so. Rhett never argued the point. He simply didn't act on it. His father, Earl Callaway, had told him once, only once, to leave the barn standing. He had said it with the kind of quiet finality that men of his generation reserved for things that were not open to discussion. Earl had been gone 11 years by the time Rhett's wife passed and left him to raise Gracie alone, and in all that time Rhett had never thought too hard about the instruction. It was just one of those things he carried forward. The barn stayed. No one was required to understand why. That changed on a Tuesday in late September when a black SUV with out-of-county plates turned off the county road and came slowly up the gravel drive. Rhett was on the porch with his morning coffee when it arrived. He watched the vehicle park, watched the driver stay inside for a moment longer than seemed necessary, and then watched a woman in dark slacks and a cream blouse step out and stand in the pale, early light, looking directly at the barn rather than the house. She was somewhere in her early 40s, composed in the way that people with serious money learn to be, and she had the look of someone who had rehearsed the next few minutes multiple times and was still not entirely certain she was ready for them. Her name was Delaney Brooks. Rhett would not know for some time who she was beyond the name on the business card she handed him, but in the county seat she was well known. The founder and chief executive of a development firm based in Nashville, a woman who had turned $200,000 in inheritance into a company worth north of $300 million. People spoke of her in the way that small towns speak of people who left and succeeded, with a mixture of admiration and wariness, as though she might want something they couldn't afford to give. What she wanted, as it turned out, was the barn. She didn't say it immediately. She accepted a cup of coffee on the porch, made brief remarks about the drive down from Nashville, and asked politely about the land. But her eyes kept returning to the barn. It wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to the look a person gets when they pass a house they used to live in. Recognition mixed with an emotion they'd rather not name. When she finally set down the coffee and reached into her jacket for the check, Rhett had already begun to sense the shape of what was coming. He just wasn't ready for the number. $2 million. For the barn alone, not the land under it, not the property around it, just the structure itself as it stood broken and warping in the morning light. Rhett turned the check over in his hands the way a man handles something that doesn't quite make sense yet. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at it from a few different angles as though the numbers might clarify themselves if approached from the right direction. Delaney stood near the window, still composed, her hands folded in front of her, with the body language of someone accustomed to waiting for people to catch up with her. Gracie was at school. The house was quiet except for the low conversation of wind through the old screen door. "You're not interested in the land," he said. She said no. He asked about the house. She said no to that too. He looked at the check again, said flatly, You want the barn. She said just the barn. He had lived on this property his entire life, and in that time the barn had accumulated no particular value, no significant contents, no strategic location, no architectural quality worth preserving. It stored rusted tools, 2 broken wheelbarrows, and a workbench that had been unusable since before Gracie was born, which made the number on the check entirely impossible to understand. What do you want to do with it? He asked. Delaney answered without hesitation, demolish it. She explained, with the tone of a woman who had anticipated resistance, that her firm was assessing certain properties in the county for redevelopment and that the barn fell within an area of interest. She was prepared to compensate him generously because she valued his cooperation. She said the word cooperation the way lawyers use it, meaning she preferred he not ask additional questions. Rhett asked them anyway. He asked what historical connection a deteriorating barn on private farmland could have to a Nashville development firm's area of interest. He asked why $2 million for a structure that most people in town would have been glad to see disappear for the cost of a few hours with a bulldozer. Delaney answered the way people answer when they've decided in advance what not to reveal. She gave him information shaped around a silence, offering details while holding back the ones that mattered. Then he asked the question that shifted everything. Have you been inside before? Something crossed her face, a contraction, a tightening at the jaw, and then it was gone. I haven't, she said. Would you like to see it before we discuss any further? The pause that followed was long enough that Rhett noticed it. That won't be necessary, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You're buying something you haven't looked at. She said she knew what she was buying. He responded with the same phrase, do you? But without a question mark, and she heard the difference. She picked up her coffee, looked out the window at the barn for a beat too long, and then said she would give him a few days to consider. She walked back to the black SUV with exactly the same composure she'd arrived with and drove back down the gravel road without looking back. Rhett stood on the porch long after the dust had settled, looking at the barn, and for the first time in years he wanted to know what was inside it. He went in the next morning. The door stuck, which was nothing new. The frame had warped years back, and getting it open required a firm shoulder and a specific angle that Rhett had known since childhood. Inside, the light came through the gaps in the siding in pale, dusty bars, illuminating a floor covered in old straw and decades of accumulated grime. The smell was dry and faintly metallic, the smell of old iron and long undisturbed wood. He started at the ground level and worked his way toward the back, the workbench, the wheelbarrows, a row of hand tools on a nail rack, rusted paint cans that had solidified decades ago. The barn had the feel of a place that time had passed through rather than stopped in. He was half ready to conclude that Delaney Brooks was simply eccentric in the way that very wealthy people sometimes are when he noticed the ladder to the hayloft. He hadn't been up there in years. The rungs were solid enough, and he climbed carefully and pulled himself up into the low-ceiling space above. More tools. A folded tarp, some salvaged lumber stacked against the far wall, and then behind the lumber sitting on a low crossbeam as though someone had placed it there deliberately. A wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, bound shut with a strip of leather cord that had long since gone brittle. He carried it down and set it on the workbench. The lock on the clasp was rusted through and came open without much effort. Inside, wrapped loosely in a cloth that had once been white, were 3 things: a small stack of photographs, a journal with a cracked leather cover, and a folded bundle of letters held together with a rubber band that disintegrated when he touched it. The photographs were the old kind, square, slightly overexposed. The color drifted toward yellow, the way photographs from the 1980s tend to do. 2 men, mid-30s. One of them was his father, Earl Calloway, unmistakably the same jaw, the same way of standing with his hands slightly away from his body, as if always ready to pick something up. The other man Rhett did not recognize, lean, dark-haired, smiling easily at whoever held the camera. On the back of one photograph, in his father's handwriting, Earl and Warren, summer '89. He didn't read it all, not then, but he read enough to understand that it had been written by his father and covered a period ending abruptly in the autumn of 1990. The handwriting in the final entries was different from the earlier pages, more compressed, less even, the hand of a man writing under some internal pressure. He read the name Warren Brooks several times. He read references to a night in November. He read his father's description of something that had happened in this barn. He set the journal down and called Cassidy Warner. Cassidy was the features writer at the Millhaven Courier, had been for 15 years, and was the kind of journalist who remembered everything and was trusted enough that people told her things they wouldn't tell anyone else. She was also Rhett's neighbor, having bought the old McCready house at the end of the road 3 years back. She picked up on the second ring. He told her what he'd found, the photographs, the journal, the name. There was a pause on the other end. Warren Brooks, Cassidy said slowly. He asked if she knew it.
I know the name,
She said. Another pause, longer this time. Rhett, that's Delaney Brooks's father. He didn't say anything. And if it's connected to what I think it might be connected to. She stopped. He heard her breathe in. There was something that happened in this town in 1990. Something that most people who were here for it don't talk about anymore. I always thought the story was older than it looked. I need to come see what you found. Cassidy was at the farm within the hour. She sat at the kitchen table and went through the contents of the box carefully, handling each photograph and each page as though the paper itself might be fragile, which it was. She had a way of going still when something caught her attention, a quality Rhett associated with people who genuinely loved information, who treated it with the same respect others reserved for more tangible things. When she set down the journal, she didn't speak immediately. She lined up the photographs, looked at them for a moment, and then looked up at Rhett with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. You need to talk to Delaney again, she said, before you make any decision about the offer. Rhett called Delaney that evening. She answered on the first ring, which told him she had been waiting. He told her he'd found photographs of her father with his, along with a journal. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that he checked the line twice. What do you want? She said finally, and her voice had changed. The polished neutrality of the morning meeting was gone, replaced by something stripped of its protective layer. He told her he wanted to understand what happened. She told him that her father, Warren Brooks, had lived in Millhaven for 3 years in the late 1980s, that he'd worked as a contractor, that he'd known Earl Calloway, that the two of them had been close in the way that men become close when they work alongside each other every season. She delivered this with the careful, clipped manner of someone who had thought through exactly how much to say and was sticking to that amount. He asked what had happened between their fathers. She said she didn't know all of it. He asked what she did know. She said she'd rather not discuss it over the phone. When he hung up, Cassidy was already pulling out her notebook. She knows more than she said, Cassidy told him. She's known for a long time. That's why she wants the barn demolished. Cassidy spent the next several days working the edges of the story the way she worked all her best stories, not by confronting it directly, but by circling it, interviewing the people on the perimeter until the shape in the center became clear. She talked to 3 people who had been in Millhaven in 1990. She visited the county archive and pulled records from that autumn. She found a brief entry in the old Millhaven Courier, 3 paragraphs buried on an interior page describing an incident at a local farm in late November of that year. The incident was described as a workplace accident. No serious injuries, no legal action. The kind of story that doesn't follow anyone anywhere because no one pushes it. But the people who were there had never forgotten it. She found Archer Hayes on a Thursday afternoon. He was 78 years old, lived alone in the house he'd grown up in on the north side of town, and had been the Calloway farm's nearest neighbor in 1990. He looked at her for a long moment with the flat, appraising look of a man who has carried something for a very long time and is tired of it. I thought someone would ask eventually, he said. He invited her in, made tea, and sat across from her at his kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him, and then he told her something he had told no one, ever, since the night it happened. The autumn of 1990 had been a hard one in Millhaven. A drought through July and August had shortened the harvest on most of the county's farms, and the mood among people who work the land was tight in the way it gets when things outside your control go wrong. Earl Calloway had been struggling that year, his wife had passed the winter before, and he was trying to hold the farm together with one part-time hand and more determination than resources. Warren Brooks had been helping him nights and weekends, not for pay at that point, just because they were friends, and that was what friends did. Archer had been there on the evening of November 14th. He said the date the way people say dates they have tried to forget and found they couldn't. He had come by to return a set of borrowed tools and found Earl and Warren in the barn finishing repairs on the equipment before the cold settled in. The three of them had a beer together. Nothing was unusual. Then Warren's son arrived, 14 years old, a quiet boy named Daniel who had driven a tractor once and was convinced he could operate anything on the property. He climbed up onto the old field cultivator without asking, the way 14-year-old boys do things, without thinking through the sequence of what comes next. He didn't know the machine hadn't been properly secured. The brake system on the old cultivator was frozen, had been frozen for years, and Earl had been meaning to address it and hadn't gotten to it that season. When the boy moved the lever just to see what it did, the machine rolled back 4 feet into the support column. The column shifted. A section of the loft floor above gave way. Earl Calloway, who was standing almost directly below the failing section, dove sideways to avoid the falling timber and landed hard on the concrete floor. He cracked 2 ribs. It could have been much worse, and everyone in the barn knew that it could have been much worse, which was perhaps why the reaction was as extreme as it was. Warren was across the barn and couldn't have prevented what happened. He knew that. Earl knew that too. But something broke in the room afterward, the kind of break that doesn't happen in the bones or the wood, but in the space between people. Warren was horrified in the way that parents are horrified by their children's accidents, with the specific scorching guilt of believing his presence had led to what happened. He apologized repeatedly at a volume and intensity that made Archer uncomfortable to witness. And Earl, still catching his breath and managing shock and pain, said something in the heat of that moment that he would spend the rest of his life wishing he could take back. He said, "You need to take your boy and go home, Warren. Tonight." He meant, go home and let me be still for a minute. He meant he wasn't angry, he just needed quiet. But Warren Brooks heard something different. Warren heard a severing. Warren heard a door being closed. Warren left that night without another word. He did not come back the next day or the day after. He called once 2 weeks later, and the conversation lasted 5 minutes and resolved nothing because neither man had the vocabulary for what needed to be said. Warren moved his family out of Millhaven before the new year, told people it was for work, told his daughter, who was 7 years old and had a life here, that they were going somewhere new and it would be fine. Archer finished his account and sat quietly for a moment. Earl never blamed Warren, he said, not for a single day. He blamed himself for saying those words the wrong way. But by the time he understood how to say it differently, Warren was gone and the address they'd had in Nashville didn't work anymore, and some things just don't get fixed when you wait too long. Cassidy asked if Earl had ever tried to reach Warren again after that. Archer looked at her steadily. He tried once more. Late. I don't know what became of it. Cassidy drove back to the Calloway farm with the recorder still running in her coat pocket and her hands very steady on the wheel. That evening, Rhett went back into the barn. He had brought a better lamp, and he went through the box again, this time slowly, reading each of his father's letters with the full attention they deserved. Most of them were addressed to Warren Brooks and had never been sent. They were drafts, a dozen of them at various stages, some only a paragraph, some 3 full pages, written and rewritten over the years as Earl tried to find the right way to say something that apparently had no right way. The handwriting changed across them as his father aged, becoming looser and more deliberate at the same time, the way old men's hands do. The last letter in the bundle was different from the rest. It was dated the others had not been. The date was March of 2004, 11 months before Earl Calloway died. It was also the longest and the steadiest in hand, as though whatever Earl had needed to work out in the previous drafts had finally been worked out. Rhett sat on the workbench in the yellow lamplight and read it 3 times. His father had written that he had thought about the night of November 14, 1990, almost every day for 15 years. He had written that he knew exactly what he had said and exactly how it had been heard, and he knew the difference between the two, and that the distance between them was the thing that had kept him up at night more than anything else in his life. He wrote that he had never once been angry at Warren, not in any real sense, that what he'd felt on that night was fear, the pure animal fear of a man who has almost been seriously hurt and whose nervous system was still firing. He wrote that he had failed to say so, and that by the time he understood how to say it, Warren was gone. He wrote, and this was the sentence that Rhett had to stop and read twice to fully absorb, that he had kept the barn standing all those years, not as a monument to what went wrong, but as a kind of promise. That if Warren or anyone connected to him ever came back, they would find the barn where they left it, unchanged, as though the door was still open. That the standing barn was, in Earl Calloway's private accounting, the only apology he could still make. Rhett set the letter down and sat in the quiet of the barn for a very long time. He called Delaney that night and read her the letter over the phone, the whole thing, from the date at the top to his father's signature at the bottom, in a voice that was calm, and even because he had decided before dialing that he would give her something she deserved to receive properly. She didn't speak until he finished. When she did, her voice was altered in a way that was immediately recognizable, not broken, but released, as though something held under pressure for a very long time had been allowed to open. She told him that her father had died 3 years ago, that he had carried what happened in Millhaven for the rest of his life like a stone in his coat, that every business success he achieved had felt somehow provisional to him, built on a foundation with a crack in it. That the last thing he had said to her in a hospital room near the end was that he had hurt a good man by leaving without clearing the air, and that it was one of the only things in his life he had not been able to fix. She said quietly, he never knew that Earl Calloway didn't blame him. Rhett said he didn't. Not once. She went quiet. He sat in the barn with the phone against his ear and listened to the sound of her breathing, the sound of someone trying very hard to hold themselves together and not quite managing it. He didn't try to fill the silence. Some silences don't need filling. When she finally spoke again, she told him why she had really come to Millhaven, not the development firm, not the acquisition rationale, the truth. Her father had kept a photograph on his desk in his Nashville office for the last decade of his life, a photograph of this farm taken from the road with the barn small and gray against the sky. She had found it in his desk after he died, and she had understood immediately why he had kept it. Not out of fondness. Out of guilt. He had looked at it every working day as a reminder of the thing he'd left unfinished. When she inherited his estate and found herself in a position to do something about it, she had decided that the only way to release her father from whatever he was still carrying, wherever he was to make the barn disappear, to remove the monument to the rupture, to close the chapter he hadn't been able to close himself. So she had put together an offer, $2 million, clean, final, without ceremony. I thought if I could just take it down, she said, it would be over. The next morning, Delaney drove back to Millhaven. She came alone this time, without the prepared composure of the first visit, parked in the same spot on the gravel drive, and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Rhett was at the far end of the porch and he watched her do it. Watched the moment she made whatever decision she made, watched her push the door open and step out into the cool October air. She had dressed more plainly than before. She looked like someone who had gotten less sleep than usual and had decided not to hide it. They sat on the porch together with Cassidy, and Rhett showed Delaney the photographs of their fathers standing together in the summer of '89, smiling at whoever was on the other side of the camera. She held one photograph for a long time without saying anything. Her father was 29 years old in it. He looked the way young men look when they don't yet know the specific weight that life will eventually hand them. Cassidy had brought the draft letters as well, all of them in sequence, and Delaney read them in order in the quiet of the porch, while the field grass moved in the wind and the barn stood at the far end of the property, gray and patient as it had always been. She read slowly. She did not rush through any of them. When she finished the last one, the date letter, the final draft, she folded it along its original crease and set it carefully on the table between them. He was trying to reach my father for years, she said. It looks that way, Rhett said. She looked at the barn. For the first time since she had arrived in Millhaven, she looked at it without the tightness around her jaw, without the controlled withdrawal that Rhett had noticed in her eyes every time the building came into her field of vision. She looked at it the way you look at something when its meaning has changed. I owe you an apology, she said. The offer was real, and I had a right to make it, but I wasn't honest with you about what it was for. He told her she had told him enough. I didn't tell you about my father, she said. No, he agreed. A beat passed between them. I spent 10 years watching him carry something that was eating away at him, she said. He was a good man, and he let one night define him in a way that was completely out of proportion to what actually happened. He didn't need to feel that way for 35 years. Neither of them did. I thought if I could just erase the thing, I could erase the weight of it. I understand now that that's not how it works. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He thought about his father, about Earl Calloway keeping a barn standing for years as a private signal to a man who never knew to look for it. He thought about the particular silence of men who don't know how to say the things that matter most and spend the rest of their lives attempting the translation. He thought about Gracie, who was 11 and was going to grow up and have complicated things happen to her and would need, more than anything, to learn that those things could be faced directly, that running away from something didn't make the weight of it lighter. "I'm not going to sell it," he said. Delaney looked at him, "but I don't think it should stay the way it is either." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "There's a historical society in the county seat that's been trying to establish a community archive for years. They don't have a building. The foundation of this barn is solid. It's just the structure above it that went wrong. With the right work, it could be restored, not kept the way it is, made into something." She listened in the way that meant she was receiving it rather than just waiting for him to finish. "There's a story here that belongs to this town," he said. "Two families, 35 years, one night that got misread by everyone involved. I think that story is worth more standing up than it would ever be torn down." Delaney was quiet for a long moment. "If I put the $2 million into a restoration fund," she said carefully, "would you be willing to manage it?" He said he would think about it. She said, "Take whatever time you need." But the way he looked at her when he said it, and the way she looked back, was something that had moved from wariness to recognition over the course of the past several days, told a more complete story than the words did. Sometimes understanding comes all at once, and sometimes it builds in layers, the way a barn gets repaired, one plank at a time, from the foundation upward, until the structure is standing again and you can see the whole of it clearly. Gracie came home from school that afternoon and found a woman sitting on the porch she hadn't met before. She looked at Delaney with the frank, uncomplicated appraisal of an 11-year-old, then looked at her father and said, "Is she staying for dinner?" Rhett said he didn't know. Delaney told the girls she'd brought good coffee from Nashville if that counted for anything. Gracie considered this seriously and said it probably did. After dinner, Delaney did stay. The three of them walked the long way around the property in the last of the light and ended up standing in front of the barn. Gracie wanted to go inside. Rhett held the door for her and she went in, flashlight swinging, entirely unbothered by the darkness or the age of the place. Delaney stood at the door and looked in. She did not go in, not yet, but she stood there longer than she had the first time, and her hands were loose at her sides. And when she turned to walk back to the house, the tightness that had been in her face since the morning she first arrived was measurably less. Some things unwind in stages. That was the first stage. The work began in the first week of November. Rhett hired a local construction crew, 3 men who had grown up in Millhaven and had spent their careers restoring old structures with the specific informed care of people who understood what they were preserving. Delaney's firm handled the financial administration and the historical research, coordinating with the County Historical Society to document the original construction of the Calloway barn, which dated, as it turned out, to 1912. It was older than anyone had realized. It was also more structurally sound in its bones than anyone had expected. The foundation was, as Rhett had said, solid. The frame was old-growth timber that had been cut to last. The structure above had failed because it had been left unattended, which was a different kind of problem, the kind that yields to attention and care, rather than the kind that requires demolition. Cassidy published the first story in the Millhaven Courier 3 weeks after the work started. She titled it plainly, "The Barn Worth $2 Million." She told the story of Earl Calloway and Warren Brooks with the precision and care the story required, which meant honestly including the accident, the misheard words, and the years of silence between 2 men who had been friends and couldn't find their way back to each other across the distance of a single unguarded moment. She ran the photographs alongside it. Earl and Warren in the summer of '89, grinning in the Calloway barn, young men in the middle of a friendship they hadn't yet damaged. The response from the town surprised Cassidy, though she later admitted it probably shouldn't have. People came forward, not all of them, but some. People who had known Earl Calloway, people who had known Warren Brooks, people who had been adjacent to the story without knowing its shape. They brought their own photographs, their own recollections, their own small contributions to a history that had been sitting uncollected for 3.5 decades. There was a specific kind of relief in it, Cassidy wrote in a follow-up piece, that comes when a story is told properly. The relief of a community that has been carrying something without a name finally being allowed to set it down. Construction took 5 months. The barn was framed, insulated, and sided with timber that matched the original in grain and color. The loft was restored and reinforced. The interior was rebuilt to serve as a combination archive and gathering space, display cases along one wall for photographs and documents, an open floor that could seat 40 people for events. The Historical Society moved their collection in during March. The doors opened to the public on a Saturday morning in late spring, and the line to get in stretched past the gravel drive and down the road. Rhett stood at the entrance and watched the town walk through the door of a building that had stood on his family's land for over 100 years and had been, for a long time, nothing more than something slowly falling apart. It was not that anymore. That day, in the late afternoon, after most of the visitors had gone, Delaney came back. She had been there in the morning, had stood at the edge of Society Director, had spoken to the Historical Society Director, had shaken hands with the gone inside. She returned in the late afternoon when the place was quiet. Rhett was putting away some folding chairs near the entrance and heard her footsteps on the gravel. He turned to find her standing at the open door, looking in. The inside of the barn was lit now by soft overhead lights, and the photographs on the wall were visible from the doorway, including in the center of the arrangement the photograph of Earl and Warren Brooks in the summer of '89. She walked in. She crossed the threshold without pausing, without bracing. She walked to the center of the space and stopped and looked around at the photographs, at the high beam ceiling restored close to its original state, at the light coming through the windows set into the original frames. She stood there for a long time, and when she finally turned around, Rhett was standing in the doorway watching her. Her expression was not the expression of someone who had won something. It was the expression of someone who had finally put something down. 1 year after the Millhaven Community Archive opened its doors, it had received visitors from 11 counties and had been written up in 2 regional publications as an example of what historical preservation could look like when driven by community meaning rather than tourism value. Cassidy Warner's article was reprinted in a state journalism anthology that year. She was asked in an interview about the piece what the story had really been about. She said it had been about the specific cost of leaving things unsaid and the specific relief of saying them too late, but still. It had been about 2 men who were each waiting for the other to speak first, across a silence that grew longer every year until they ran out of years. It had been about a daughter who flew to a small Tennessee town, carrying 35 years of someone else's guilt, intending to bury the thing in concrete and call it done. And it had been about a barn that, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be the most important structure in the county. Rhett Calloway had converted a section of the north pasture into a walking trail that led from the house to the archive, and Gracie had painted the trail markers herself in the barn's original colors, faded red and white. She was 12 now and had strong opinions about the display arrangement inside the archive, and had already told the Historical Society director twice that the photograph of Earl and Warren should be moved to a more prominent position. The director had agreed both times. On a Saturday in late October, an hour before sunset, Delaney came back to the farm. She had been back a number of times by then, and the trips had taken on a different character than the first one, less purposeful, more natural, the way you return to a place because you have begun to belong to it. She and Rhett stood together in front of the archive's new door, which Gracie had painted a deep barn red. Delaney looked up at the building for a moment. "Turns out it wasn't something I needed to buy," she said. Rhett looked over at her. "What did you need?" She smiled. "To walk in. There are places in the world that don't hold gold or treasure or secrets worth money. They hold something harder to carry and harder to let go of, the truth about who we were to each other and who we still have the chance to be.